modern white flour and then the manchet. So this is modern white flour. So when you go to the grocery store and you want white flour, that is what they'll use. Pass it down. And then this is manchet flour. So this is the flour that I had imported from England. So this has been stone milled and then sieved. And again, it's made from those two different species of wheat. So this one is about as close as we can get in our modern world to what they would have made their food out of. And I found that it performed astonishingly differently. It does not want to make bread. It has a very low gluten content, but it is beautiful for the kind of baking I do. It is very cooperative. So the other main ingredient in the crust then is the lard. Thank you so much. So this lard happens to be from an heirloom breed of pig, which is Tamworths. So Tamworths are very hairy. They're really ugly pigs. This lard is rendered. So this is rendered beef lard. So I don't know how much you know about pig anatomy. So we're pretty fat, right? So pigs have fat kind of all over their bodies like we do. And they also, similar to us and similar to other mammals, have gut fat. So this is leaf lard, which is that gut fat. So it's a harder fat. It performs better. My observation, so this lard also, somewhat coincidentally, happens to be from a pig I helped slaughter. So I got to see what it looked like inside. And even though heirloom pig breeds tend to have more fat than modern pig breeds, traditionally reared pigs do not put on a lot of body fat. They stay fairly lean until they get much older. Medieval pigs were killed at rising 2, so that's after they've lived for a year and then between their first and second birthdays. So they would not have had time to put on a lot of body fat. They would, however, still have that gut fat. So that's why I choose to use lard, that type of lard, that leaf lard, as my recreation lard. As for the filling, so the main ingredient in the filling obviously is the bird. So if you don't mind, I'm going to bring you, perhaps infamously, you may have heard yesterday, the bag full of dead birds. I do have Sani wipes. So if you are really, they're also all wrapped in plastic. So I have tried to accommodate our modern sensibilities. If you would like to touch them, please do feel free. We do have little wet naps. Thank you, Your Grace. I knew I could trust you for it. That was a little risky. I'm going to try not to drip. So I'm going to hold these up so that you can see. Do you mind getting me out a Sani wipe now that I've dripped upon myself? So our different options that we have. Thank you. So modern birds are astonishingly different from medieval birds. Thank you. So it is very difficult in this day and age to get heirloom breed anything unless you know a guy who knows a guy. And I do know a guy who knows a guy, but it's the wrong time of year. So what I tried a few different options in the process of recreating this pie. So this is a stewing hen. This chicken lived a pretty long life. It may not have lived a happy life, but it lived a long life. It tastes like a chicken. The issue is this is an older bird. So although it has what I consider to be normal bird proportions and a normal chicken taste, we know from archaeological evidence, consuming birds at all was a sign of wealth and a sign of social status. There are substantially more bird remains from high status contexts in the archaeological record than from urban or rural contexts. We know from that archaeological data they were not eating old birds. They were eating young, tender, tasty birds. So I was able, I have a butcher who loves me, right? That's what this comes down to. When I ask him for crazy things, he gets them for me. So I was able to get, this is a poussin. So this is a young chicken. You can see how tiny it is. Try to not drop. So this chicken did not live very long. This is an immature so this is a poussin, this is a young chicken. You see it's very tiny. So this is immature, it's not live a long life. They cook much more quickly, they have a much milder flavor. So I came to realize that my initial search for a chickeny chicken was probably anachronistic. That I suspect that a medieval diner did not want a chickeny chicken. because that's a chicken that's lived longer. They probably, if we gave them a nice, bland, modern chicken, would have said, oh, that's lovely, how did you do that? That's great. I want more like that. So this was one of the birds that I used. Pigeon's also tricky. This is the squab. So this is a pigeon. Tiny little pigeon. It's interesting. So the archaeological record, there's not good archaeological data for pigeons for whatever reason. They don't show up in the archaeological record, but we have tons of written evidence that they ate pigeon. That squab was an extremely common food in high status contexts. We have surviving dove coats. Their bones don't show up in most of these assemblages, and that's a little weird. We don't have a good explanation for that. So this is a modern farm squab. Even though pigeon breeding, you're not aware of this, show pigeons are completely a thing. Even though pigeon breeding has advanced pretty dramatically since the medieval period, that sort of generic dove, they still look roughly the same. This is roughly analogous to a medieval pigeon. And then the last bird that goes in this building is the small birds. So in the original, this would have been thrush or other, thrush was the most commonly consumed songbird. It is not entirely, but largely illegal to kill songbirds in the U.S. Not entirely, just mostly. I'm working on getting, anyway. In the interim, so this is a quail, and it is a wee little thing. So this is the smallest bird that I could get without either raising my neighbor's suspicions or having weird conversations with the local constabulary. So I used quail. We know that they had quail. We know that they ate quail. Yes, thank you. But they typically, they would have delineated that out. So they would not have just called it small birds and lumped them into it. Did anybody else need it? So they would have delineated that out as quail instead of just calling it small birds. The other ingredients that are within the filling, so we have currants, which would have been imported. So those are raisins of Corinth is where the term currant comes from. So they're botanically a grape. They're not ribes, which is what most people call currant now. It would have been imported. That's another sign of wealth. This also has 2 different spice mixes. Thank you. So there's some currants. Would you bring that top for 3 spice bottles from the bottom? So this has both saffron and 2 different spice mixes, powdered deuce and powdered fort. So powdered deuce is a sweet spice mixture, which Fava has in her hand here. Feel free to huff it, taste a little bit. We can hook that up, you're great. So powdered deuce is a sweet spice. You will notice, again, even though we're in an English context, we're using many French terms, so that is another sign of this higher status context. And then powdered fort, which is a strong spice mix, and then that's saffron. Again, imported, costly, these are another way of showing our wealth. With the filling, there are a number of specialized techniques that go into this, so it is a very labor-intensive process. So I find that it takes me a day to make this pie. So there's stewing the birds, there's separating the bones from the meat, there's preparing the filling the pies, and baking them. For the one detail that I thought was really interesting in the recipe is when it talks about wringing the eggs through a cloth. So I am lucky enough to have some very cooperative backyard chickens who provide me with eggs. So I was able to test a few different methods. There are my eggs. That one's from Dottie, and that one is from Butters. So I was able to test this different method of wringing it through a cloth, and what I found is that it does filter out the chalazi, which are so inside the chicken, there's a yolk. And there's these 2 little swirly bits that attach it to the chicken as it travels through the chicken. So those are called chalazi, and those get filtered out when you squeeze it through a cloth. So it yields a much finer finished product. So I think that's another way that we're sort of showing with this recipe. You have a highly trained kitchen staff. You have the time. You have the liberty to make this filling. I could talk about this all day, and I probably will if I don't put the reins on myself. I'd like to go ahead and open this up and I'll ask you some questions.